He sat alone at the edge of the street, in a faded uniform, in a rusty old wheelchair. No name tag, no ceremony, just silence. People walked past him, didn't stop, didn't ask. But when the Marines came marching, the parade stopped. It was a gray morning in Elmsfield, the kind of small American town where time doesn't move fast, and no one's ever in much of a hurry. Memorial Day was always the same here. The streets would fill with folding chairs, paper flags, and kids holding plastic horns. The local high school band would tune up around 11:30, just before the fire trucks rolled out. Old men in faded uniforms would line up by the war memorial, ready to march a few blocks for the town's annual salute. But this year, someone arrived, earlier than anyone else. At the far edge of Main Street, before even the organizers showed up, a man sat silently in a wheelchair. His coat was old, his shoes were polished, and though his shoulders were stooped, his back remained straight, like muscle memory never quite forgotten. His name was Frank Delaney, and unless you lived next door, you probably wouldn't have noticed him. He wasn't the kind of man who made noise. He didn't talk about the past. He didn't stand out. Not anymore. But today, he wore his uniform, not for show, not for attention, but because this was the day he'd chosen, the day of the parade, the last one he'd ever see. Frank had made a quiet arrangement a few days earlier. He knocked on his neighbor Emily's door, a thing he'd never done in all the years she lived next to him. She thought he was coming to complain about the kid's soccer ball. Instead, he handed her a small American flag and simply asked, "Would you take me to the parade on Sunday?" There was something in his voice, something final. He didn't tell her about the diagnosis, didn't mention the pain, didn't talk about how long the doctor said he had left. All he said was, it would mean a lot. So that morning, Emily helped him into his dress blues. They didn't quite fit anymore. The buttons strained at the belly, and the shoulders hung loose. But he straightened the collar himself. Slowly. Deliberately. He looked in the mirror once. Just once. Then nodded. Frank Delaney hadn't always been invisible. 70 years earlier, he was just a farm kid from Missouri. Tall, lean, stubborn. The kind of young man who didn't say much but stood straight when spoken to. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1950. 2 weeks after his 18th birthday. The morning after his brother came home in a flag-draped box from Okinawa. He didn't talk about that either. In Korea, Frank saw more than anyone should. Cold nights in frozen trenches. Friends gone in seconds. The kind of fear that crawls into your bones and stays there, even after the bullets stop. But there was one day, one moment, that never left him. It was late autumn, 1951. His unit was ambushed near a ravine. Smoke, shouting, the dirt erupting all around them. Frank's best friend, Corporal Reyes, was hit. Twice. And their commanding officer was pinned down under heavy fire. Most ran for cover. Frank didn't. He ran toward the gunfire, dragged the officer out with one hand, pulled Reyes onto his back, and carried them both nearly 400 yards through mud and bullets. He should have died that day. But he didn't. The commanding officer, a young lieutenant named Jacob Mendez, lived. Reyes didn't. Frank never filed a report, never spoke about what happened. When the war ended, he turned down the commendation, declined the ceremony. All he said was, "I did what anyone should have done." Then he disappeared. He moved to Elmsfield in 1972, bought a tiny house with a VA loan, grew tomatoes in the backyard, fed birds, fixed radios, never married, never had kids, and never ever went to the parade, until about a decade ago. That's when he started showing up. Always alone, always quiet, always watching from a distance. Emily had asked him once why he came every year if he hated crowds. He had smiled, soft and sad. Some of the guys I served with, they liked parades. I figure I'll stand in for them. But this year was different. This year he hadn't come to stand. This year he came to say goodbye. The cancer had come back, harder than before. His body was failing, and Frank knew. Doctors gave him 2 months. He didn't plan to use all of it. He refused the hospital bed, refused the morphine, refused to be remembered as someone curled up in a room, waiting. Instead, he asked for his uniform to be pressed. He asked for one ride into town, one last look, one final salute. But what Frank didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that someone else remembered that day in Korea. Someone he had saved, and someone who had waited decades for the chance to repay that debt. At exactly 12:03 p.m., the parade began. It started like every other year, a sheriff's car with flashing lights, a line of antique tractors, the high school marching band playing slightly out of tune, brownie scouts, Vietnam vets in Harley jackets. Frank sat quietly at the far end of Main Street, where the parade route would turn and head back toward Town Square. Few people noticed him. Some glanced politely. Most were focused on the parade, their kids, the music, the floats. He didn't mind. This was never about being seen. It was about bearing witness. Then came the Marines. 47 of them, full-dress blues, impeccable formation, eyes forward, boots pounding the pavement in perfect rhythm. And leading them, Colonel James Mendez, the son of Lieutenant Jacob Mendez. Frank didn't recognize him at first. Gray temples, tall, stern. But in the way the man carried himself, the way he scanned the crowd, measured, alert. Frank saw something familiar. As the Marines neared Frank's position, Mendez raised his hand. A sharp single motion. The entire unit stopped. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. The parade behind them hesitated. Band members slowed. Flags dipped unintentionally. Something was happening. Mendez turned, walked alone across the street, and stopped in front of Frank's wheelchair. "Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney," he said clearly, voice rising above the wind. "You are not forgotten." Frank blinked. The crowd went silent. Mendez turned around, facing the town. "Most of you don't know this man, but without him I wouldn't be standing here. In 1951, my father, Lieutenant Jacob Mendez, was wounded in Korea. 2 bullets. No cover, no hope. One man dragged him from enemy fire, risking his life to save another. He gestured behind him. That man was Frank Delaney. He never told anyone. He refused a medal. He moved here and lived quietly, alone, as if nothing had ever happened. Mendez's voice cracked slightly. But my family never forgot, and every year we march in a unit named after him. Delaney Platoon. The crowd stood frozen. Phones hovered mid-air. Mothers clutched their kids. A single clap began, and then stopped, out of reverence. Then one by one, each Marine in the unit stepped forward, saluted, and quietly said, "Thank you, Sergeant." 47 times. Frank's lips trembled. His hands shook. Then slowly, with great effort, he raised his arm and returned the salute. He said nothing, but his eyes, glistening, wide, said everything. Emily stood off to the side, hand covering her mouth. She had no idea. No one did. The man who'd fed birds and refused help with his groceries was a ghost from a war no one talked about, now being honored by the generation he'd unknowingly saved. The Marines resumed formation. They marched on, not to cheers, but to silence. The crowd didn't move for several minutes. Children asked their parents what just happened. Veterans stood a little taller. Frank, still in his chair, closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't alone anymore. The parade moved on. The crowds eventually scattered. The marching band played its final note. Kids ran after candy tossed from floats. Vendors packed up. But something had shifted in Elms Field. People didn't just return to their routines that afternoon. They walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, glanced more often at the old man in the wheelchair, the one they had passed by so many times without knowing. Emily wheeled Frank back to her car. Neither of them said much. Frank kept looking out the window during the ride home, not at the town, but at the sky, as if searching for someone or waiting for a sign. She parked in front of his small white house, helped him out of the chair, guided him inside. Before she left, he held her hand and said softly, "Thank you for bringing me." She smiled. "I think you brought all of us somewhere today." That night, Frank died in his sleep. No pain, no noise, just stillness. His hand was resting on his chest. His uniform still hung by the door. And beside his bed, carefully folded, was the same photograph he had carried in his pocket that morning. A young Marine, muddy and smiling, his arm thrown around a friend who wasn't in the frame. No medals on the wall, no plaques. Just that one picture and a folded flag. The next morning, Elmsfield woke to headlines they never expected. The last parade, a hero remembered. The video of the Marine salute had gone viral overnight. Thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of views. Veterans from other towns reached out. Families sent letters. Strangers drove hours to leave flowers on his porch. Frank Delaney, once invisible, had become a symbol. At his funeral, the small chapel was filled to the door. People stood outside in the sun, silent, holding flags. The town's mayor gave a short speech, but it was Colonel Mendez who delivered the final words. He never wanted this, never asked for it. But a man like Frank doesn't belong in silence forever. He paused. He saved my family. He served his country. And he reminded us all that the strongest heroes don't march for glory. They march because they must. Then came the final tribute. The same 47 Marines from the parade returned. They didn't speak. They marched once more, slowly, deliberately, down Main Street, past the church, past the flagpole, past the house where Frank had lived. They stopped in front of his home, removed their hats, and saluted. No words, just the sound of a breeze and the rustle of flags. That night, the porch light at Frank's house stayed on. So did the candles down the block, and the next one, and the next, until the whole street glowed, not in mourning, but in memory, not in sadness, but in gratitude. Some people are remembered in headlines, others in statues. Some have stories passed down from generation to generation. But men like Frank Delaney, they live quietly. They leave quietly. And too often, they are forgotten quietly. He never asked to be noticed. He never demanded thanks. He didn't tell war stories at bars or show off medals at town events. But that didn't mean his story didn't matter. It mattered deeply, because Frank represented something we all need reminding of, that real service is silent, that duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off, that some of the greatest heroes are the ones who never raise their voice, only their hand in salute. Frank's life wasn't filled with awards or applause, but it was filled with integrity, sacrifice, and dignity. And in the end, those things mattered more than recognition, because recognition fades, but honor lasts. As the years pass, we often forget the names of those who made our freedom possible, not because we don't care, But because the world moves so fast, parades come and go, flags rise and fall, wars end, and memories slip away. But moments like Frank's remind us that remembrance is not about grand gestures. It's about choosing to look closer, to pause, to ask, to listen. We all know someone like Frank, an older man who walks slow, a woman at the grocery store with a military tattoo, a neighbor who always lowers their flag exactly at sunset. Their stories are there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard. So the next time you attend a parade or walk past a quiet veteran on a park bench or see someone standing at attention during the national anthem, remember Frank. Remember that behind every silent salute there may be a life filled with bravery the world never saw.